So that is actually not what we're going to be hearing about this morning, but that is a promo for a new series that we're starting next week, where we surveyed over the course of the summer Tom's River and asked them two really important questions: why they hate God and why they hate his church. And Tom's River spoke back with an absolute vengeance and gave us really great feedback. So what we did was we boiled that down into a 7-week series where we're going to ask those tough questions like, does God even exist? How do I trust the Bible? Why are Christians hypocrites? And we're going to try and answer those questions from the Bible. So if you have ever struggled with doubt or know someone who has, that is the series for you. So we're going to start that next Thursday right at our Wellspring downtown location. Listen, this is now my second time ever giving a sermon. My first time was this past Thursday. Thank you very much. So I appreciate if you have a little grace and, I don't know, whatever, with me as we go into this. So for the last 15 years of my life, I have worked for a ministry called America's Keswick. You saw that in the video. And they focus on addiction recovery, but to support addiction recovery and to bring awareness and funds, we do all kinds of other things like concerts and conferences and retreats and stuff. So my first job there when I was 13 years old was working in their dining room. And I'll never forget my first day on the job. I was working as a waiter, and there was a church there that just wanted a relaxing time away, let their worries fade away. And then came Graeme, 13-year-old Graeme, in the dining room. And a guy had flagged me over, and all he wanted was a nice cup of hot coffee. And again, I was a little nervous. I hadn't properly been trained about the way to serve a table. And so I walked over him with this thermos, and I was holding the cup right over his lap. You can see where this is going. And my hand was shaking as I began to pour. The cup overflew and went all over this guy's lap, scorching him. And needless to say, it didn't go well. So it wasn't long after that the supervisor at the time thought it would be best that I find another avenue to use my own personal abilities. And so about a week later, the supervisor of their audiovisual department came to me and said, "Graeme, would you ever be interested in kind of learning about sound and lighting and video? I really could use an assistant." And, well, the waiter thing wasn't working out. So I decided, sure, why not? And that became a journey for me of falling in love with sound, audio, and video, so much so that I ended up going to a 2-year course over at the Lakehurst Naval Base to learn more about sound. And my first year there, I loved it. I had a 4.0 GPA, classmates loved me, my teachers loved me, and as my knowledge began to expand, something else began to expand, and that was my ego. And yeah, not a proud moment. And my boss came to me about a year into that program and said, "Graeme, something's come up last minute. There is a concert tomorrow night. You've never really run sound by yourself before, but I need you to step in. Is that something you think you can do?" And my response on the outside was, "Sure, no problem. This is something I think I can do. I've been to school for a year. You take the night off. I will make sure everything's okay." And on the inside, my response was, "Yes! This is my moment to show everyone how amazing I am." So that day, and he made sure that, there's a picture on the screen of an old-style mixer, and you can see there's hundreds of little knobs. My boss made sure that they were all preset to make sure that night was going to go flawless, to make sure I was going to be a success. So I came in that next day for sound check, and listen, I have been to school for a whole year for this. So what I did was I turned all of those little knobs to 0 and thought, I'm going to start fresh. Well, spoiler alert, the night went absolutely terrible. And there were 500 people there for a concert, and at the end there was a gospel presentation, and my pride and ego ended up ruining that night. And the next morning, I had to go into my supervisor and sit down with him, and he said, "Graeme, I heard some feedback, no pun intended, that the night didn't go so well." production booth. And I had to eat a big slice of humble pie and let him know that, again, I let my pride and ego get in the way of what God was trying to accomplish that night. You see, our failure and defeats can be incredibly, incredibly painful and embarrassing. But it's what we do with that failure that is so important. You see, failure can make us better, or failure can make us bitter. Failure can make us better, or failure can make us bitter. Today we're going to look at a similar story with the disciples and how they and we tend to put ourselves in the driver's seats of our lives instead of Jesus, and the damage that can ultimately do when we let our pride and our ambition and our cockiness take over. So today we're going to jump into the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is one of the 4 books of the New Testament that focus on the life of Jesus and his 12 disciples and how he handpicked them to train and teach and carry out his ministry. In today's story, we're going to look at the disciples and how they learned a very hard and raw lesson about faith, dependence, and prayer. But there's another person in this story, and this person is the one I'm really excited to share with you this morning, because we're going to learn about the heart of a broken father who encountered Jesus in a way that he has never had before, and he will experience for the very first time his beautiful grace and his reckless love. So you ready to dive in with me? All right. So Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 14. You can use the Wellspring app, or you can follow along on the screen with me. So when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, Jesus, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able to." And Jesus answered them, saying, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." So let's set the scene in this verse real quick. A few verses before this very moment, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to a literal mountaintop. And in the church world, what we call this is the transfiguration of Christ. And what this moment means is God the Father in heaven literally declared on a mountaintop that Jesus was the Son of God. And it was this amazing moment where Jesus literally glue of light and 2 dead guys appeared on either side of him, Moses and Elijah. And this was, again, an amazing moment where Jesus was declared that he is the Son of God and the Savior of the world. And then this moment stops very abruptly. And it stops abruptly because the cross of Jesus comes before the crown of Jesus. And Jesus is on mission to save the world, and that's not finished yet. So immediately, right after this mind-blowing moment, the 3 disciples and Jesus come walking down this mountain. And what they come across is the rest of the 9 disciples arguing with these scribes. And the way I like to look at these scribes are modern-day know-it-alls. I personally like to watch a lot of YouTube. And in the YouTube community, there's something called internet trolls. These are people that criticize everything, but don't actually do anything. And in this moment, they were mocking and criticizing the disciples, saying, "You say you follow this Jesus, but you couldn't heal this boy. Maybe the Jesus that you serve isn't who he says he is." And all this moment was doing was putting more and more doubt into this crowd and into the brokenhearted father. How our sin and our failure not only affect us, but when we do, our sin affects the people around us and the literal mission and gospel of Jesus itself. Now, next we read that Jesus asked the disciple a question. What are you arguing about? But the only one that responds was a broken-hearted father. And when I was studying this, I was thinking how easy it is that when we sin, we let that break communication with our Jesus. That when we let the shame of our sin come upon us, we are not living out the true gospel. The disciples in this moment were not living out the true gospel. They were letting their sin separate them from the amazing grace and amazing forgiveness of Jesus. But the beautiful thing about this is that there are people in this room right now that can look at me and say, I can find failure in you. But they will never be able to find failure in my Jesus. And that is the hope that we have. Sorry, lost my train of thought. One of the things, too, is that we need to understand about this father is that back in this day, there wasn't urgent care or 911 calls to make. This father had a son that was being possessed by a spirit and having all these physical ramifications of that. And there was no hope for him. He couldn't dial 911. He couldn't go down the street and check him into urgent care and say, I need help with my son. He just had to sit there and deal with that pain. But in this story, this is about midway through Jesus' ministry. And word had gotten out that there is a man out there that is doing things that no other man has done before. And there was a glimpse of hope, and this father needed to check it out and what this was all about. Now listen, I am not going to have all the answers today, and I can tell you for a fact I'm not the smartest guy in this room. But what I can tell you that Satan, that demons, that hell, that evil are very, very real, and they have a very, very focused goal in your life. And that is pain and destruction. And we can see that in this story. And the only answer to that pain and destruction is Jesus. The next few verses, I have to tell you that when I first read them, I had to read them again and again and again, because my initial response was, geez, this is not the Jesus I know. This is not the Jesus that we sometimes have pictured in our head. This is not the pale-faced, always smiling, forever hugging Jesus. But this is Jesus that was literally just declared on a mountaintop that he is the Son of God. And when he questions these disciples, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? This is Jesus knowing the mission he is on and what is at stake if this doesn't go well. And that mission and what is at stake is you and I. You and I are the mission of Jesus. And in this moment, we are seeing Jesus feel the weight of the disciples living only by sight and not by faith. Jesus knew that in a short time, he was going to die on a cross and leave this world, and his disciples were going to need to live only by faith and carry out the mission of Jesus. And in this moment, they weren't getting it. It's so easy for us in our walk with God to get caught up in the techniques and tactics, thinking through, am I going to church enough? Am I reading my Bible enough? Am I doing enough community kindness things? And forgetting the fact that am I simply walking close with God? Am I simply listening for God and what he wants to do in my life? Listen, whenever the disciples separate themselves from Jesus, bad stuff happens. And whenever we separate ourselves from Jesus, bad stuff happens. When we start putting our faith in our own abilities instead of the one who gave us those abilities, we are in for a world of trouble. As followers of Christ, I don't care if you've been a Christian for a day or a Christian for 40 years, we never advance beyond our need for Jesus. So let's continue reading, starting in verse 20. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, it immediately convulsed the boy, and he fell to the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, if I can, all things are possible for the one who believes." And immediately the father cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw the crowd coming, running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command that you come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing the boy terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse. So that most of them said, "He is dead," but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he rose. And you need to try and imagine this scene. This is truly a heartbreaking scene where you're seeing the father who's dealing with a boy. We don't know the age. But this is the father that's been living for years, watching this spirit take control of his son, casting him into fire and into water. This boy's skin is probably mangled, and you're seeing this boy convulse, and he's having an encounter with Jesus. When I was studying this scripture, I was reading some commentaries, and I think it's important to note that in this scripture, we're uniquely looking at a demon possessing a boy. But in the commentary, what they said was one of the things that resembled what this boy was dealing with physically, not spiritually, but physically, was someone that had epilepsy. And when I read that, my heart broke. For those of you that don't know, my father was born and raised in Africa. He was a missionary kid. There's a picture going to be on the screen of me and my dad. And at the age of 18, my dad was riding a bicycle in Africa and was struck by a car, and ever since that day has struggled with epilepsy. And what that means is that my dad can sometimes go a week or have multiple seizures a day. And all throughout my childhood, that is what I've experienced with my dad. And there's a few stories that kind of ring with me. My parents used to really help with stage design and setting up. And it was during the Christmas season that one late night, my parents were on a stage much like this, and my dad was working on hanging Christmas ornaments from the rafters. And he was going up a ladder, and he had a Christmas bulb, and as he got right to the top, my dad had a seizure. And I remember being 6 years old and watching my dad fall off that ladder and see a piece of lattice work strike through his hand. And I'll never forget, again, being 6 years old, not truly understanding what's happening, and seeing my mom burst into tears and the commotion that started, not knowing what to do, and feeling desperate heartache and confusion and pain in that moment. It wasn't too long after that. I was probably, again, maybe 16. I was in my bedroom watching Netflix. And in my house, when you hear a crash, it meant my dad was hurt. And again, my mom was at work, and all of a sudden I hear boom, 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 boom. My heart sunk. And I came running out of my bedroom, and the scene that I saw was my dad laying head first down the staircase with his neck cracked. And my dad wasn't breathing. And I remember running over to my dad, and right as I touched him, I heard him gasp for breath. And I remember in that moment feeling so much confusion, and do I call 911? What do I do? Do I touch him? I don't want to hurt him more. What do I do? What do I do? And I called my mom in tears. And as a family, we have lived that desperate pain and confusion And some of you in this room today have dealt or are dealing with desperate pain yourself, not unlike the father in this story. Some of you walked in today, and maybe on the surface you're wearing this mask. Your marriage is okay. But you know after church, the minute you walk down that hallway and you walk into your car, you're waiting for that next fight to start. I know it's going to be over. And you're worrying what to do with the kids, and you're living in this heartache and this pain. Some of you in this room are living with unbelievable debt. Some of it because of bad choices, but some of them because it's the medical bills, and you don't know what to do, and the calls are coming in, and you're living in desperate pain and confusion. Some of you are dealing with secret drug, alcohol, or pornography addictions. And maybe last week you were on your computer and you're looking at things you shouldn't look at, or maybe this past Friday night you had a needle hanging out of your arm and you're just waiting for that next shot to take you out because you don't know how to deal with it anymore. Some of you in this room are dealing with loved ones that are sick. And you're in the hospital and you're feeling helpless and you don't know what to do, or maybe you've lost a loved one. And you have this in your heart right now, and you don't know what to do. Well, today I have the answer for that desperate pain, and that answer is Jesus. I want you to understand this. The answer to that desperate pain is Jesus. We have a God that is willing to reach down into the valley of our lives and have us experience His amazing grace and His reckless love, a love that isn't afraid to get dirty in the valley of our lives, and He will simply walk with us. In this moment, the Father experienced something that the disciples let fade away, and that is true faith. In this moment, having spent years in confusion, in pain, and heartache, the Father reached a point where there was no other plan A or plan B or plan C. The only plan left was Jesus. And having experienced Jesus for the first time face to face, He took what little faith He had and asked God humbly for more. If you're in this room today and you are struggling with doubt or confusion or desperate pain, God can take whatever little faith you have and do incredible things with it. You just need to stop running and start kneeling and saying, God, I can't do it anymore, but you can do it. We never advance beyond our need for faith. Let's continue reading as we finish up. Verse 28, it reads, "And when He entered the house," this is after the event, "the disciples asked Jesus privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And He said to them, 'This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer.'" In my teen years, I became very angry with God. Because I would look at my father and say, God, why aren't you healing him? My father did everything right. My father loved his family. My father went to church. I watched my dad read his Bible in his study. And I would look at that and say, God, why aren't you doing it? But it wasn't until later that I learned that my father wasn't praying for God to heal him. My father was praying for God to use him, and God answered that prayer. To this day, my father is a leader in his church. My dad does love his family. My dad does help mentor guys who are going through that addiction recovery program. My dad is being used by God, and God answered his prayer. I am the man I am today because I have a Father who humbly trusts his Jesus and seeks him out in prayer. You see, though, in this moment, having failed, the disciples were living out endless growth, which is one of the values at Wellspring. our value Endless Growth reads, there is no limit to the number of lives that can be reached for Jesus or the impact he can have on us. And in this moment right here, the disciples are living that. Having failed publicly, having been mocked by their critics, they go to Jesus and say, Jesus, why did we screw up? Why could we not do this? And Jesus responds by saying, you can't do it, but I can do it. And as followers of Jesus, if we can live that out, beautiful things can happen and our prayers will be answered. The disciples are just like us, living in persistent failure, too ready for arguments, chaotic prayer life, more eager to learn about tactics and techniques rather than simply walking close with God. But the Father in this story highlights our big thought for this morning, and that is that true faith comes through humble prayer. My dad is a living, breathing story of our big thought today. That if we're willing to bring our pain and our doubts to God and humbly lay them down at his feet, God can literally do miracles in our life. This whole church is a literal miracle. 2 years ago, a D's Get Degrees pastor was commissioned to get a team together and plant a church. And do you know who he got? He got some truck drivers, he got some landscapers, he got a singer, he got a tech guy, he got some woman who sends up rockets into the sky. On paper, this team shouldn't have been able to accomplish anything. When I was thinking back at 2017, we have literally seen over 100 people come to a knowledge of Jesus Christ in this church. Over 100 people, over 40, yes! Over 40 people get baptized. We have given away thousands of dollars in free diapers and gas. Next week, we move to multiple services. There is life change being experienced in this church every week, and do you want to know why? It is not because that we're super smart or super talented or have everything together. This is because as a church and as a leadership team, we can say we can't do it. But he can do it. And we fall on our face and say, God, help us. I'll remember it was almost exactly this time last year that Jason came to me at Bayside Chapel and said, Graeme, I want to talk about the marketing and advertising plan for launching Wellspring in March. So he sat down and he said, Graeme, I have prayed and God has really laid on my heart that I really don't want to spend a lot of money on advertising. I want to put the lion's share of our resources into our free gas day. Okay? You see, for the last couple of years, I've been in marketing. And when I heard that, I said, Jason, I don't think you understand. You see, this isn't conventional. That if you want people to come to your church, you're going to have to let them know. You're going to have to tell them about it. And Jason, no. This is really what I'm feeling God is telling us to do because I want to be a church that relentlessly loves Toms River. I want to be different. Okay, different sounds great. Let's see where this goes. And for a huge time, I struggled with saying, this isn't the way to do it. This isn't conventional, and I don't know if this is the right way. And I had to get to a point where I said, God, I can't do this, but you're going to have to do it. And I had to fall on my knees and say, Jesus, you're just going to have to use me. You're just going to have to use me the way you want me to be used. And that stupid Facebook event that we invested almost zero money in reached over 100,000 people in Toms River with this message. That we exist to ignite a craving for Jesus by relentlessly loving our community. And that day was a huge success. And it wasn't a huge success because of anyone, including me, on that team. But it was because a group of people fell on their knees and say, we can't do it, but you can do it. And my encouragement to you today, yes. My encouragement to you today is I am not a pastor. Spoiler alert. I've actually never even been to college. I work a 9-to-5 job just like most of you. But what I can tell you is that when the average person falls on their face before God, miracles can happen. And that's my challenge for us today. This is a big challenge. Wait for it. Starting January 2nd, as a leadership team at Wellspring, we will begin 40 days of prayer and fasting for some mission-critical decisions that are coming up at this church. Some of you have heard and are experiencing, next Sunday, we will not be in this room. Remember, we will not be in this room, so don't come here next Sunday. We will be at our Wellspring downtown location. And that's because this school, we no longer have access to it. And you are probably sitting there going, Graeme, I don't know if you understand. What about parking? What about well kids? How are we going to fit? And the same questions you're having, we're having too. But God has opened up this door to us, and we're walking through it, and we don't have all the answers. And there is this huge fog over these decisions. So as a leadership team, we are going to fall on our knees before God and say, God, we need your wisdom, we need your direction. And my challenge for us today is, will you join us? Now, Pastor Jason couldn't be here today. He's actually in New Hampshire with his family, which is awesome. But as Jason, he has some words he wanted to share on this. So we're going to check out a quick video from Pastor Jason.
All right, I get it. I go away for Christmas. Graeme preaches his, he did well, didn't he? He just actually preached for me in my living room. That's where we're at right now. And I get it, I left, and Graeme puts before you, let's fast for 40 days and go before God. So that means I'm not going to eat for 40 days. Jason, could you never leave again if people are going to come and put something that outrageous before us? And the truth is that Graeme and I spoke ahead of time. We planned this out. This is something that I think is an absolute necessity for our church. As I studied with Graeme through this passage, worked through the sermon with Graeme, and as I saw what our church is going into, what we've come out of, guys, I beg for you to take Graeme's challenge to heart. That we as a church, as individuals, but then collectively would fall on our face in desperation before God. Does that mean we're going to go all Gandhi and not eat for 40 days or whatnot? Not necessarily. If God puts on your heart not to eat for 40 days, I'm going to do the legal thing and say you should consult with a doctor first. But in all seriousness, that's not what I'm going to be doing. What I'm going to be doing is I have shared with Graeme and my wife for accountability a 40-day diet plan where I'm going to be altering what I eat and eating very, very little. And then some days I'm going to do a full fast. But the heart behind fasting is foregoing something, sacrificing something where two things happen. A, you make up the time in your schedule. So if I'm not eating for a day, I then have the meal time to use as prayer time. I also start feeling hunger pains. And so when I start feeling hunger pains, it's this natural reminder to go to God in prayer. And so that's what I want to encourage you to do is think through, okay, for the next 40 days, starting January 2nd to February 10th, how can I go to God in prayer? How can I open up time in my schedule? What could I sacrifice? What could I fast to open up more time? And then what would help me to feel some pain, some natural pain that would serve to remind me to go to God in desperation, go to God in desperation for something personally and for my church. And here are the two big picture things that you can be praying alongside with us is the binged series. Guys, we are going before the community, begging them to come through our doors because they have big questions that we're looking to answer through a biblical perspective. Do you think Satan isn't going to want to attack that? Do you think he's not going to want to distract and thwart and do whatever he can when we're hoping that people will come to know Jesus through answering their big questions? Pray for us, please. Secondly is location. The school is great, but is it long-term for us? There are opportunities that come. I literally this week had a second church that has come to us saying, there's a possibility we might want you to think about taking us over. Like, that's a big deal, and those can either be distractions or those can be godsends. Guys, would you please pray for the direction of this church, that we feel a big fog right now. God, where are you taking us? We as a church are in desperate need of God's leading. And so take Graham's challenge seriously. Go to before God in prayer. Consider prayer and fasting. Graham will be posting on social media and whatnot, a website, through our website, about what prayer and fasting is, but check it out. I'm excited to partner with you guys in the ministry of prayer as we seek God out. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Give Graeme a big round of applause. And I'm on Team Graeme. I know that's a thing. So we love you guys. Peace. Bye.
So as we wrap up, the disciples let their pride and their jealousy and their critics force them into doing life and ministry in their own strength. And they failed publicly. How easy it is for us to get cocky and start doing ministry and life in our own strength. In this story, the disciples use Jesus used the life of a broken-hearted father to teach the disciples a lesson on humble prayer and faith. In this life, we will face many trials and ups and downs and heartaches. And if we don't handle those correctly, that sin and that failure will not only impact us, they will impact the people around us, and they will literally impact the gospel and mission of Jesus. Often in life, prayer becomes the last place we go instead of the first. But we need to understand that faith is what bridges the gap between the power of a living God and our own human weakness. True faith only comes through humble prayer. Only desperate people pray. Because desperation is a place of humility, saying, God, I can't do it, but you can do it. So my question for you this morning is, are you desperate? Are you desperate for His grace? Are you desperate for His forgiveness? Are you desperate for His reckless love? Because if you are, all God asks you to do is simply empty your hand and say, Jesus, I can't do it anymore, and you need to fill me. True faith only comes through humble prayer. Let's sing.